Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Rudolf Otto and Naturalism and Religion, published in 1907. We're going to take a look at our third lesson. We're going to take a look at pages 66 to 97. It will wrap up chapter 3 and we'll start chapter 4. And remember, this work from 1907 preceded the idea of the holy, which came out in 1923. So this was the book that built the building blocks, laid down the building blocks for his later work, the idea of the holy. But we're going to take a look at pages 66 to 97. We're going to take a look at the impressions of the real that affect numinous consciousness. Let's begin with block 1 and take a look at impressions of the real. Otto tells us that religion contrasts the insufficient world of appearance with the sufficient real world. The real equals true being, which is believed in. Religion is the quest for the real. It's an ongoing praxis. Religion is an ongoing dialectic of praxis in the quest for the real. It's beyond appearance, and Otto says that the transitory or the sensate should be considered parable. It is parable. So if we take a look at note 2, the transitory as parable, religion posits the eternity of true being. Time is the fundamental form for our concepts and knowledge, but time is a veil that conceals the real. We posit the idea of eternity. Space, likewise, cannot correspond to true reality. So the temporal realm mediates the real, but it's not equated with the real. It mediates the real. It's a veil over the real. It's a veil over the transcendent real, but it is not in complete correspondence to that reality. So his conclusion, note 3, praxis as real and existence as parable, means we need to seek the attainment of true reality. Being exists as perfect synthesis. The sensate points beyond itself to its own transcendence. Appearance points beyond itself in our feeling and in our intuition. In other words, within numinous consciousness. Within numinous consciousness. As deep impressions that are made within our soul or within state of mind. So it all springs up out of our inward experience of numinous consciousness, where we grasp the meaning of being. But it is not yet expressible as concept. But Otto tells us that then we do, through the experience of time in the feeling intellect, we do move forward to idea as concept. So we do transition to idea as concept once we pass out of numinous consciousness into the realm of the feeling intellect. That's where idea as concept begins to become concrete. It's the beginning of concretion. Not yet concretion in actuality, but the beginning. That realm of the feeling intellect is where we begin with ideas as concepts, or better yet, ideas as signs. That's the way we really should say it, ideas as signs. So we'll move on to block 2 and take a look at these impressions that become ideas as signs or concept. And like we learned from the idea of the holy, again he tells us we begin with phobeo, fear. We intuit the real from the harmony of nature and from the, I like this the concept he uses here, and from the terrifying and the bewildering enigmas of nature. They are terrifying, the terrifying. He always begins with that consciousness of fear we know from his later work, the idea of the holy. The mind becomes affected and startled, and it drives us into self-forgetfulness, that asuchadzo that we talked about. And he calls this the wordless ecstatic moment. So we begin in numinous consciousness as wordless ecstatic moment. We confront the eternal. In this book he calls it the eternal, but in his following book he's going to call it the holy. we confront the holy initially as wordless ecstatic moment. So let's take a look at note 2, block 2, note 2. This moment is in the mind, and it forms associations to create religious consciousness in the feeling intellect. So we move into religious consciousness once we transition into the feeling intellect. And we take on an attitude of worship. But initially it's just expressed aesthetically, but the intellect moves forward. It does posit a horizon, it does posit a teleology, and the feeling intellect also posits the notion that existence evolves from purposeful thought. That's what caused us to transition into feeling intellect, because out of numinous consciousness, we posit that existence evolves from purposeful thought. So under note 3, this is where we recognize the sign of things, the significance of things. The sensate reality includes signs that point beyond themselves. Sensate reality is a parable composed of significations that point beyond the sensate toward the transcendent. And so Otto tells us this is outside the realm of naturalism. Divine plan is seen as evidenced in human consciousness and the spiritual worth of humanity. The feeling intellect posits the idea of providence, and the feeling intellect begins to form that schema of signs, because numinous consciousness and the signals from numinous consciousness teach the feeling intellect, emotively teach the feeling intellect. Remember, it begins as aesthetics, so emotively influences the feeling intellect to form the schema of signs. And that brings on the idea of providence as necessity in note 4. Religion subjects the world to teleological interpretation. Sensate world is to be conceived of as conditioned by providence. The spiritual is not derived from nature, it is autonomous. Naturalism fails because it denies the special dignity of human consciousness, where this all begins, says Otto. It all begins in that numinous human consciousness, which naturalism neglects, or calls it a mechanistic reflex. Remember from our previous lesson, they just call it a mechanistic reflex. This is a significant failure on the part of naturalism, says Otto. So we know that from sensate reality, we receive and internalize impressions of the real, of the transcendent that is veiled behind sensate reality. These impressions are internalized, and as they are internalized, we kind of begin with that sense of awe, of phobeo, fear, which is kind of an awe when being confronted by the holy, or awe when being confronted by the eternal. But we do transition out of that into the feeling intellect, and we start positing horizon, we start positing teleology, we start positing purposeful thought. And eventually from there we move on to a formation of a schema of signs, because the religious consciousness perceives sensate reality as containing sensations as a parable with signs that point to the transcendent, to the real. That's going to take us on to block 3. Now in block 3, Otto tells us that naturalism hasn't remained pure to its original mechanistic view anyway. Naturalism suffers a split within itself, as those who still favor the mechanistic view, but there are some evolving who oppose the mechanistic view. So let's take a look at block 3 and take a look at this split within naturalism theory. We begin with the problem of the mind. Naturalism says that the higher forms of life have descended from the lower forms. They posit a theory of descent. But what about when nature brings forth that which is full of meaning, that which is full of purpose? Naturalism calls purpose modified adaptations. Naturalism says all creatures are bound together in genetic solidarity. So Block 3, Note 2, this genetic solidarity is a continuous process according to naturalism, and the world is governed by the outcome of primitive stages. Differentiation goes on in nature as a blind process of selection. Adaptation is brought about in purely passive manner. So Otto concludes in 3.3, the problem of consciousness and this idea of passive adaptation means that naturalism has become an evolving idea. They began with the first axiom, everything happens naturally. Second, monism is the true. And even self-differentiation of organism is abbreviated under monism. However, today, naturalism has split into believers in doctrine of descent and believers in the doctrine of epigenesis. There's been a split. So, Block 3, Note 4, the split in naturalism, the sufficiency of natural selection is posited by some, but rejected by others. The struggle for existence can be chief factor, cooperative factor, or indifferent factor with regard to the origination of new species. Some persons emerge within naturalism as opponents to the theory of descent. And so he concludes this lesson by asking, so what should the attitude of religion be, having understood these 3 moments here in this lesson? He wants us to consider this, to consider the fact that the religious point of view posits consciousness, which begins as a numinous consciousness in confrontation with the eternal in this book. Later he's going to call it a confrontation with the holy, in the idea of the holy. But we do begin with that phobeo. That phobeo, that's, by the way, that's from that is from Mark 10:32. That's where he gets that. If you remember our previous study in the idea of the holy, Mark 10:32 is where the Greek New Testament mentions the phobeo, fear of the disciples when confronting the holiness of Christ. That is mentioned here as confrontation with the eternal. We begin there, but we don't remain there. We begin there, but then we move on to feeling intellect. We posit horizon, we posit teleology, we posit purposeful thought, and we start reading sensate reality as containing signs within its parable of life. It does contain signs that points beyond itself to the transcendent. That reality, from the religious point of view, coupled with the reality of the split in naturalism theory, is going to force us to move forward in our bridge building between religious thought and naturalism. And we're going to pick that up in the next lesson, but we have basically great additional content. Having completed 3 lessons now, we're going to be ready for a summary composite lesson next. We will do that. Our next lesson is going to be lesson 3B, because we're going to do a composite and kind of encapsulate our first 3 lessons in this book, so we get a good foundational picture of where we're going to go in the remaining pages. We've pretty much got the first 100 pages covered, so after these first 100 pages, I'm going to put together a composite, and that's going to be our next lesson. But this will conclude the all-important remainder of Chapter 3 and half of Chapter 4, pages 66 to 97, on the impressions of the real that create the numinous consciousness of the real that creates transition into the idea as sign in the feeling intellect, coupled with the evolving naturalism theory that has split into 2 camps. So we'll pick up next time with our composite summary.